It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Property Podcast episode 86. That's 86. I'm Rob B. With me as always is the fine Rob D. Hello Rob, how are we?
We are very well, thank you for asking, and very excited to be getting into some listener questions. Always really good episodes. Thank you to everyone who sent in their questions. We're going to get through as many of them as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. Plus, we've got, I was going to say a sensational news story, but more of a sensationalist news story. Got to love some of those.
You have. And I always introduce you as how are we, like we're Gollum from Lord of the Rings or something like that. We've got multiple personalities. But obviously we know you are very sane and normal. This week, I'm really looking forward to this week's episode. We've got loads of questions in, actually. We asked you a few weeks ago, and we've got loads and loads in. So we are super excited to run through those, and there's plenty and plenty you can learn from. But before we do that, really just a quick mention that Property Investment Tips, our other podcast, if you are a new listener, you may not know, but we've got a second podcast that's still very, very new called Property Investment Tips. You can find more about that podcast at thepropertyhub.net/PIT. That's PIT. But basically, it's a short podcast where we take blogs on the website and read them out to you and then give you our opinions on them. It just means that if you prefer absorbing audio content rather than written content, then this is definitely for you. The feedback so far has been absolutely fantastic. So have a look, see how you get on with it. And if you enjoy it, we'd really love your support. Reviews are greatly welcome. We've had lots in already, but if you can get behind us, especially at these early stages, we will be very, very appreciative.
Yes, we will. And yeah, we've had lots of really nice emails about this one. People finding it very convenient. And a couple of emails from people I've had saying it's their favourite of all the things we do, which I was slightly put out by because it's the shortest and it's the one where we chat the least. But I guess that's probably, I don't know if that's just a correlation or a coincidence.
Yeah, none of our crap jokes. Right, okay. So moving swiftly on before we start doing some of those, let's look at our news story of the week. And Rob, this week, we often go positive and a lot of news stories are fastest growing areas, biggest capital growth, biggest yields. Well, it's completely flipped on its head this week, and it's the 20 worst places to invest in property.
Yeah, or as they put it, the property investment black spots revealed. Gotta love that. It all sounds quite sensational, but the idea of this is they've put together a list of 20 locations where property prices have fallen by more than 7% in the last year. I think it's interesting in itself because it reminds you that you can't just kind of look at the headline and take the UK as a whole. There are parts of the UK that are doing very well and people are talking about a bubble. But then there are other parts where prices have been sliding. So I think that's the first takeaway. But it's also interesting that there are some London boroughs in this list. So there are boroughs like Westminster, Soho and Belgravia, where prices have fallen by 5% or more in the last 12 months, which is not necessarily what one might have expected. And then you've also got some in there which are more like the usual suspects. You've got places in the northeast and so on. But it just goes to show that the property market is not one unitary thing. There are bits that are doing well and there are bits that are definitely not.
Your favourites in there, Rob, Burnley.
I'm not going to go there again. Well, I'm literally not going to go there again after what I said last time, but I'm also not going to get into another Burnley rant. I think I got off lightly. I haven't had any hate mail.
Yeah, well, Bonfire Night's coming and they're not putting Guy Fawkes on the top anymore. That's all I'm saying. Right. It is an interesting news piece. Have a look. Some good data there. Some of the, as Rob said, some of the more places you would expect to see, but also a few surprises, some wealthy London boroughs as well, which kind of correlates to some news pieces that you may have seen where the top of the London market is coming off, and it seems to be the case. So have a look. You'll find it in this week's show notes, which are thepropertyhub.net/listener questions. So let's get into those listener questions, Rob.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's get straight into it and play out our first question, which is from Christopher Brown.
Hi guys, a quick question for the Property Podcast. It's generally accepted interest rates will rise in the not too distant future. What do you think the consequences of an interest rate rise will be, and do you reckon there will be any negative, unintended consequences as a result of this rise? Cheers.
Thanks, Chris. Good to hear from you again. Thank you for leaving that message. Right, interest rates going up. A given. Absolutely. It seems to be the data constantly getting pushed back, though, which is interesting. But it will happen at some point. This year, well, there's not much left of this year, so no. Next year, if it does happen, and I'm not completely convinced it will, but if it does happen, it'll certainly be the second half of next year. The general consensus is that it will happen next year at some point, but it was the early part of the year, and it's keep getting pushed back expectations of what it'll be. I actually think that with the pension reforms in April, that might have a stimulus effect. So therefore, the economy is boosted, and towards the end of next year, we will see some rises. But the fact is, they are going to go up at some point. So what will happen? What will the consequences be? Well, if you're on a long-term fixed product, you've got nothing to worry about because your rates are fixed. If you're on a variable, hopefully you're on a short-term variable, and most mortgage products are for 2 years. If you're on a 2-year variable product and you're already in it, chances are by the time the rates go up, you'll be either coming out of it or close to it. So you can have a look at new mortgage products. So what will it do to new mortgage products that are coming out? I think that's what's interesting. Think back before we look forward. Before the last crash in 2008, if we look back at what was happening in the boom, interest rates were a lot higher. So say when they were at 5.5%, for example, what was interesting is the buy-to-let products that were out then were 5.7, 5.6, which is really interesting because the banks were pretty much taking zero margin on those products. Why? Extreme competition, because the property market was booming. So lots of banks wanted to grab as much as the market as they could. So they were taking very, very small profit margins to be able to win your business. Fast forward to today. Well, actually, not quite today. Go back a year ago. A year ago, buy-to-let products were around about 5%, the average product rate, and interest rates were 0.5. But go forward to today, the average rates are about 4%. So wait there, interest rates haven't moved in the last year, but the rates have gone down from 5 to 4 for an average product. Why has that happened if the Bank of England haven't moved interest rates? And it's simple. It's increased competition. Over the last 12 months, the property market has moved and more lenders have come into the market. And as more lenders have come into the market, they're trying to fight for your business again. So they've been willing to accept smaller margins. So they've been borrowing at just over 0.5% and we're getting 5%. But because more people came into the market, they've now started charging 4%. So it's dropped the whole percent. So Chris, my theory is that as property prices start to move up, the economy recovers, what will happen is, yes, interest rates will start to rise, but also we'll have more increased competition from the lenders. So as the lenders try to win your business, they will take less and less margins. So actually, although interest rates will go up, I don't actually think the products will be much more expensive at all. In fact, if the rates go up to say 2%, they could even drop to 3.5% because competition keeps pushing it. We'll see. It's a theory, but I'm pretty confident on it. Let's see what happens. None of us have crystal balls, but that's what I believe will happen. Competition will bring down the bank's margins. It already has happened over the last 12 months, and I really think it will continue to happen. So my general view is, don't be too worried. Unless you're on a long-term variable that you can't get out of, which I don't think many people would be, then you've got nothing to worry about. And actually, enjoy the competition that we're going to see over the coming years, because we should get some really good products.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the Bank of England base rate is obviously a factor, but competition is a big factor as well. Well, for a start, it's not like the base rate is going to rocket up. I think the economy is clearly in quite a mess. And so when changes do come, it's going to be quite gradual. So interest rates aren't going to rocket overnight anyway. And even when they do, how much will it affect mortgage rates? I don't really know. So it's not something that particularly worries me as an investor. It's something which is obviously going to happen and we'll deal with it, but I don't think the consequences are going to be that severe. And also you could take the view that when rates do go up, there will inevitably be more repossessions and people struggling to pay their mortgage, which is not a great thing in the bigger picture. But for investors, it is a good thing because it means there's going to be more opportunity out there. So as investors, we have to react to whatever the broader picture is and deal with whatever comes our way. Feels like we've been talking about this for a very long time and there's still not much appetite to raise rates. But when it does happen, we'll finally find out if we've been right all this time. So come back to this episode in a year's time and see how we got on. Okay, let's move on to our next question, which is actually a constellation of questions from Jay Caution.
Hi guys, thanks so much for putting together such a good podcast. I managed to have listened to all the episodes in roughly a month now. I'm currently re-listening just to make sure I haven't missed anything. I'd just like some advice on flats for maybe an episode or one of the smaller episodes. I know you've done the investment of flats compared to houses, but I'd just like to know more on the actual flats itself. Down here in the south, if you haven't got a huge amount of capital, flats are one of the only forms of investing. And actually, in a lot of the really good up and coming areas, flats are the best investment, I think, for both rental yield and capital growth. There just seems to be so many fiddly things regarding a flat that I don't quite know everything about, and therefore it's just slightly putting me off the investment. Regarding the renovation purposes, how does the planning work on a freehold or a leasehold? How can you just go in and start knocking stuff down? If not, is it the freehold? They have a committee, I know. How does the short lease work? Can you always be guaranteed to buy it? How much is it? What stipulates the amount it is? The mortgages, the maintenance, just sort of all the things really that are involved. That would be great. I'm running out of time, but thanks guys, and thanks so much for your help. Bye.
Okay, so a few questions in there. So Jay's looking at investing in flats, and he's asking about permission for renovation, about short leases and extending those leases, and about mortgages and maintenance as well. So there's lots of different points in there. Let's start with an easy one. Renovation. When it comes to that, you have to check your lease to see what you need the freeholder's permission for. So there are some things that you're pretty much always going to need permission for, things like changing the windows if they're single glazed and you want to double glaze them. But there are other things that are going to vary. So there are some ex-council leases where you can't change your front door, for example, but I'm sure there are lots of others where you can. Annoyingly, you'll normally be pretty deep into the conveyancing process before you actually get to see the lease. And this is where we talked about the process in Scotland in the past, where everything's on the table from the word go. This is one of those annoying things about the system, where if there is something in the lease, whether it's a restriction with what you can do or some kind of other covenant or terms that you're not happy with, you're going to be quite far down the road and you'll have invested time and perhaps money in it before you find out. But essentially, you just need to check your lease and see what you can and can't do. While we're on the subject of leases, when it comes to short leases, I actually went and looked up the answer to this, and so I can quote the 1993 Leasehold Reform Act at you, and which is always a treat. And this act basically gives you the right to extend the lease by a further 90 years. So anyone has the right to do that. The cost of doing that has to be negotiated between you and the freeholder. And if you can't agree on that price, then you can go to a leasehold tribunal that will set the price. And you have to be aware that as well as the actual cost of extending it, you'll have to pay the freeholder's reasonable legal costs as well. But although it is a cost, it will of course add value to the property because it's making it more marketable. The other thing to bear in mind is that when the lease goes beyond 80 years, something called marriage value comes into account. Why it's called marriage value, I have no idea, but essentially it means it gets more expensive. Hey, maybe that's why it's called marriage value. Everything gets more expensive. Yeah, basically don't let the lease get below 80 years. And if you're buying a property with a short lease, if you know what you're doing, it can be quite a nice niche. I know people who do really well, but that is something that you need to take into account.
So, Jay, to answer some of your other questions, mortgages. Mortgages, though. Where to start? This could be a rant, but I'll keep it brief. Yes, it can be. Doesn't mean it will be, but it can be more tricky. For example, blocks that are 5 stories or more, some lenders can be a bit funnier about. It depends on the type of block and also its location as well. They are favourable if it's a tall block in a city centre, especially London. But if it's a tall block elsewhere, they might not be so favourable. Doesn't mean you can't get lending, it just means there's less lenders available. Also above commercial property as well. So if the ground floor is commercial, it can, not necessarily will, but can cause you some issues as well. There's a lot of hoops you have to jump through with mortgages, whether it's flats or houses, to be honest. So this is why we always say use a broker, especially someone who's experienced with working with investors. Because if they do this all day long, they'll know, okay, that lender's not going to touch this because there's a restaurant on the ground floor, or actually that lender won't go near it because it's a new build and it's over 4 stories. So what I would say is, yes, there are some restrictions. Can you get lending? Absolutely, because they wouldn't build these blocks without lending. And I've seen this happen before where one broker said, oh no, you can't get lending on this, and another broker's gone and found a product. Also, don't take the first no as the final answer. Go and speak to a few brokers, because some just are better than others. It's like any walk of life, any profession. But it can be a challenge, but don't worry. Work with a professional and I'm sure they'll find an answer for you. And in terms of maintenance, well, that's one of the upsides of owning an apartment or a flat. The majority of it you won't have to pay for. So with a house, if the roof goes or anything like that, it's obviously your concern. With an apartment, hopefully your service charges will cover that. The reason why I say hopefully is the levels of service charge and the majority of works that are carried out are out of your control. And you've got to hope there's a sinking fund there as well, because the management company isn't going to just pay for it themselves. So it's something to look into, especially if it's an established block. So a block that's older, check what the sinking fund is, because if you think, oh, there's potential of works here in the next 10 years, if there's nothing put aside, then that's something to be concerned about. If it's a new build, they've got time to build up that fund because it's brand new. It'll often come with a builder's guarantee, so you don't have to worry about it as much. But generally, that's one of the upsides of owning a flat or apartment, is the lack of work, the lack of maintenance that you're going to be responsible for. However, we've done a podcast episode on this before, flats versus houses, and we've recently done an episode on property investor tips on the same subject. So go and listen to those podcasts and see how you get on with it. Okay, so next up, I like this name, Rob, we've got Miss Money Pocket.
Hello, Rob. I wonder if you can help me with a query. We are currently renting out a property in the south of England, and our problem has been with some of the tenants we've actually had in the property. One of our tenants ran up debts to the value of £40,000, which we weren't aware of until she had left. And another tenant actually managed to set fire to the property, which meant that we did have a problem with nobody occupying the property for 6 months. And it was only me fighting with the managing agent that I managed to get any insurance money. So my question really is, how can we ensure that the people going into our property are the right people? For example, the lady who set fire to the property, unbeknown to us, was disabled, used a wheelchair. Our property is on the second floor and doesn't have a lift. She's obviously disabled, and we didn't know that she was having her rent paid by the Social Security, which we did not know until she set fire to the place, and the county council came to us to rehouse her. So I'm just wondering, with the terrible experiences we've had, is there any way that we can ensure that we know more about the tenants that go into our property to stop this happening to somebody else?
Wow, so she's not had a good experience there. Very sorry to hear about all that. Hard to know where to start with all that. So you've got a tenant who was disabled and you didn't realise, who received housing benefit and you didn't know, and who set fire to the place. I mean, you're always going to have bad experiences, but that's quite a few bad things all in one go. And what can you do to avoid that in future? Well, presumably you used an agent, because if you'd put the tenant in yourself, you'd know more about them. And so really, you just need to make sure that you're using an agent who understands your requirements, understands what kind of tenant is suitable for the property, and then doesn't just stick anyone in there without telling you. They should really run potential tenants past you and be honest about their circumstances. So, for example, at Yellow Lettings, when a landlord first brings a property to us, we ask them if they'll accept tenants on benefits, if they're okay with children living in the property, if they're okay with pets and what kind of pets, and smokers and all that kind of thing. And we won't put forward tenants who aren't appropriate, who don't fit their needs. And then when we do put forward a tenant, we always get the landlord's approval. So we'll say, we found this tenant, we'll get them referenced, we'll tell them about any circumstances that they might need to know about and get them approval before we put them in there. So really, your agent should be doing something similar so you don't end up with anyone wildly inappropriate in there. However, you just can't be sure. So hopefully you'll avoid anything truly horrendous like happened to you, but you just can't be sure. Even if you put in someone who on paper is the best tenant ever, who's got a great job and got glowing references, you just don't know what's going to happen in their life. They could lose their job tomorrow and all kinds of things could happen. And that's why, with Yellow Lettings, we guarantee the rent and we encourage landlord to take out insurance to cover anything that happens to the contents. So you said, how can we make sure people going into our property are the right people? There's a lot that you can do, but for the things that you can't, there are insurance products and guarantees available to cover those eventualities that you're just not sure about. But hopefully, if you have the correct process in place to start with, or you work with an agent who has that process, then you've minimized the risks and you won't be unlucky enough to have something really awful happen.
Going through those lists of disasters, and that did not sound like a happy experience at all. We have to look at it as a whole and go, rather than how would we solve these problems, something we mentioned on the podcast before, prevention is always better than cure. The prevention here is choosing a good letting agent or management agent, because clearly whoever you've used has completely let you down massively. What could you do differently next time? Or anybody listening, what could they do? Research. I mean, we bang on about research so much, but research the letting agents you're potentially going to work with. Yes, of course, we're going to say Yellow Lettings is great, but there are other good agents out there too. But there are a lot of bad ones. That's why we started Yellow Lettings. So do your research, check what bodies they're members of, look for reviews, Google them, see how people are responding to their service levels. Spend that time there, because that half an hour of research could save you multiple hours of pain further down the line. So with these things, and most things in property, prevention is definitely better than the cure. Next up, a familiar voice. It's Graham from Money Stepper.
Hi guys, Graham from MoneyStepper.com here. Firstly, a huge thank you for the great content you provide across the podcast, the hub and everything else. I've learnt so much about property in the past year or so because of yourselves, and I'm very grateful for it. Secondly, I've got a little question for you. You've done a couple of episodes in the past regarding mortgages. As ever, they are full of very useful information. But I want to know what happens if you don't tick the standard boxes. I'm personally returning from a 2-year stint abroad and will be self-employed upon my return to the UK. Unfortunately, I'm therefore, very much a computer says no case. From the iTunes reviews, I know that the property podcast community is varied, widespread, all over the world, and so hopefully I and many others would find an episode on non-standard mortgages very useful indeed. Anyway, thanks again, guys, and keep up the good work.
Thank you for the question, Graham. Good to hear your voice on the podcast. Well, a couple of different things in there. Let's start with the self-employed part. If you're self-employed, it doesn't mean that you can't get a mortgage. It just means that lenders will usually want to see at least 2 years of accounts. Not always. So if you work with a good broker, they might find lenders who are more relaxed about that. But as a general rule, they'll want to see 2 years of accounts. And generally, that's evidenced with something called an SA302. And that's basically a tax receipt that you get from HMRC. They don't just send them out to you by default. You have to actually call up and request them from HMRC. So if you're going to be applying for a mortgage soon and you're self-employed, it's a good idea to just call up and ask for them. They'll send them through in the post, and you can use those to prove your income. Sometimes you can use an accountant's reference instead. But this is really one of those circumstances where if you're self-employed, it's like any kind of non-standard circumstance, even though being self-employed seems pretty standard to most of us. For lenders, it seems not to be. And this is where having a good broker is invaluable, because they're going to be able to find out about your specific situation and give you advice, which is far better than anything that we can do on the podcast. Every lender is different in terms of their requirements, and so there might be what looks like a few options, but a broker will quickly be able to tell you that one of them is not going to happen, and so you're just going to choose from the other two. In general, though, getting a mortgage for a buy-to-let when you're self-employed isn't all that tricky as long as you have got a history of accounts, because when it comes to your ability to repay, lenders are mainly looking at the rental income of the property. If you're self-employed trying to get a residential mortgage, it can be a lot tougher because they're looking at whether you can repay the mortgage from your own income, and that's where you get into all kinds of things about whether your income is consistent. They could ask about what contracts you have coming up. They could disallow lots of things if you've got overtime or anything like that. It's a lot more complicated, but generally for buy-to-let, not so bad.
No, it's not so bad at all. I mean, this question is almost made for me, Graham, so thank you. Because the people I deal with at RMP Property all the time are business owners, self-employed, contractors. You know, a lot of people who come in for the strategy sessions are people who often fall into those categories. And clearly we don't just say, oh, come in, here's a strategy, but you're not going to be able to get lending. They do. It's you know, sometimes it's a challenge, and sometimes, again, you've got to jump through those hoops. But Rob's right. That's where the broker and what we've mentioned before, that's where they really add value. We don't have a broker service. So, by us telling you to go and use brokers all the time, there's no financial benefit to us whatsoever. We just do it ourselves, and we think you should too. Rob and I probably know more than the average man or woman on the street about mortgages, but we still don't do our own mortgages because they add so much value and their expertise and knowledge is well worth paying for. In terms of expats, again, it can be a challenge. And there is one option that you can do without a broker. So to completely contradict myself, but you can't go through a broker to do this, is check out HSBC as your first port of call. So again, we get a lot of expats who work with us. So what we always say to them first up is go and see if HSBC will lend to you. Well, are HSBC in your country, whichever country it may be? And if they are, go and have a conversation with them. You've got to go direct, and they are slow. And make sure you're speaking to the right person, because I've had people go into HSBC and be told no by one person. They've come back to us. I've said, no, go back again. And then they've got a yes from someone else. So make sure you're speaking to the right person. But actually, for people overseas, they will normally give you lending on at least 5 properties. I've got clients who've managed to wangle 10 out of them. So that they're obviously pretty good negotiators, but for most people, they'll be able to get 5. Of course, your circumstances have to be right, but they are open to lending here in the UK if you're overseas. If HSBC isn't an option, there are other lenders, and the criteria is a little bit more strict, and there are less options available to you, as you would expect, but it can be done. Now, this is where a specialist broker would come in handy. At RMP, if somebody comes in from overseas, we just refer them details of a specialist broker. If you're overseas and you're listening to this and you'd like the details, or Graham, if you'd like them, just drop me an email. Just email hello@rmpproperty.com and ask for the international broker's details. Again, I've no financial involvement with the guy who we pass his details on to, but we can send it out to you. Word of warning, you do have to fill out a big form with plenty of information, but you are asking for money off a bank. So that's to be expected. But it can be done for self-employed business owners, contractors, expats. I've seen lending given to all of them.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for in this round of listener questions. We'll do another one soon. I hope you found this useful. If you've got a question, never hesitate to leave us a voice message. All you have to do is go over to thepropertyhub.net/podcast. You'll see a button on the right-hand side, which you can click to just record a message straight into your computer. We'll then be able to play it out on the show, answer your question. And if you've got a question, chances are lots of other people have it as well. They just haven't thought to us, so it's going to help a lot of people out as well.
Okay, so it's time for our resource of the week. And Rob, I'm a little taken aback on this one. I would consider myself close to being a fanboy of Google because I use all their apps in our business. We use Google Drive in Yellow. I use it in RMP. I use it all day, every day. I love everything they do. And you've gone and found a resource that's from Google that I've never heard of. So a round of applause. I can't believe you've dug this one out. So the question is it any good?
Well, I'm actually going to have to pass the credit for this to my wife, because this is something that she uses that I had never heard of either. But she keeps telling me how good it is, so I thought I should share it with everyone else. What it's called is Google Keep. And it's essentially a note-taking app. So you could see it as an alternative to Evernote. So we are both big Evernote fans. We've talked about it plenty of times in the past. But if you're using lots of Google products anyway, you might find it worth checking out Google Keep. It's got a lot of the same features in terms of leaving notes, taking photos, and then the text within those photos being searchable, all that kind of thing. One feature that's really cool that I don't think Evernote has, but I might be wrong. But what's really cool is that you can set yourself reminders which are location specific. So you can be like, when I'm at the office, remind me to pick up this bit of paper. And it'll come up with a notification on your phone when it detects that you're in that location. So you get reminded about it when you're in a position to do something about it, rather than just seeing it in your to-do list when you're at home and that's not a lot of good to you. So that's one pretty cool feature. But in general, I think it's worth you giving it a go, Rob. If you're deep in the Google ecosystem anyway, you might as well see how you get on with it.
Are you going to move away from your beloved Evernote?
I'm not going to say that. It's too early for all that. But maybe I'll just start giving it a go for those location-specific things and see how I go from there.
Yeah, it looks interesting. I'll dig into it a little deeper. The only thing is, I'm so pot committed to Evernote now because there's so much of my stuff in there that it's almost the effort of starting something new. However, if you don't use Evernote and you're looking for a service like this, then look at both. Look at Evernote and look at Google Keep as well. So check out both and see which one works for you. I take it with it being Google, Rob, it's free. I know Evernote's got a free version and a paid version, but this is all free?
It is completely free. So nothing
awesome.
To lose, but lots of your time messing around, making yourself less productive by comparing productivity apps, which is a trap that I think I fall into sometimes.
Well, a trap I don't mind falling into is the iTunes reviews. So I love going through, reading them and seeing all the feedback we get. And this week's no different. What another great review. And this one is from, I don't know if this is his or her birth name, ACSWL. Sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly.
Cruel parents.
And they say, game changer. Dear Rob and Rob, the review of mine is way overdue. I've been listening to your podcast since about autumn last year, and I've been a firm fan ever since. What I've learned listening to you both infuse about property on my commute to and from work has been invaluable. All the information one would ever need to know about property investment is delivered in a relaxed, uncomplicated manner, which makes it accessible for all. I love also that instead of sitting back and basking in the success of the podcast, you took it further and created a community for all of us with the Property Hub, to which I've already signed up and I'll be introducing myself shortly. I've just bought my first property, which is waiting to be refurbed while I bought it to live in and rent it out eventually. It looks like I'll be renting it out sooner than I thought, so I've been listening to all your episodes again to remind myself the basics. Thanks so much for all your efforts and well done on an excellent podcast. The one I listen to every week religiously. Well, thank you. That's another awesome review. Some of the reviews recently have just been really, really humbling. You know, I don't say that lightly. Like some of the changes that people are making because you say you've listened to the podcast is just amazing. And that's why we have no intention of stopping anytime soon. You know, we've not missed a week since we started, including an episode that went out on Boxing Day. We'll keep doing it if you keep loving it.
Yeah, we will. And it is just brilliant to hear about the changes that people are making. So do leave us a review, not just so we can talk about how great we are, but so we can share your progress and inspire other people and make everyone else who's listening realize that you've done it. You're no different from anyone else, so they can do it as well. And I think it's just absolutely brilliant to hear stories like that being shared.
Absolutely. And if you ventured onto iTunes to leave a review, you may as well do property investment tips while you're there.
Yeah, that's just efficient, isn't it?
Yeah, that is being efficient and a system. So we can only applaud you for doing both. Right. Next week, Rob, we've got another episode, which I think will add a lot of value. 5 universal investment principles. So it's not just investment principles for property. It's 5 principles that apply to any investment you look at.
Yep, that should be a really good one. So we got quite deep into some specific questions this week. But next time, yeah, we're taking it out nice and broad to make sure that when you're digging into any kind of investment, you don't just get stuck in the specifics, but you can zoom out as well and go, does this meet these universal criteria? So that should be a really good one.
It should. So until next week, thank you for listening again. We always appreciate your support. We'll be back same time next week with another podcast. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.